Hi. One of the most complicated special counsel filings was recently released to the public. And that would be the John Durham filing regarding essentially claims made by the Trump administration regarding spying. And the initial allegation by Trump was that the FBI or an intelligence agency was spying on him during the Obama administration. In other words, during the time when Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were about to face off in the presidential election. And it turns out that Trump was wrong about that. And we know Trump was wrong about that because to the extent the FBI was involved in his servers, there would have been a wiretap. In other words, information would have been intercepted by way of a wiretap. The filing mentions something different. It mentions something called a DNS lookup. And these DNS lookups didn't have content. And so, most likely, the FBI was not involved. It was somebody else. The question was, who was it that was accessing Trump's servers during a time when he was about to run for election against Hillary Clinton? Now, there's been allegations that it was Russia or foreign governments, etc. We'll get to that. But this is extremely complicated, so forgive me if I try to go through this step by step. So number one, we have the allegation by Trump that the FBI was spying on him. That allegation is false. But when you're being spied on, one of the difficulties with unauthorized surveillance is not only is there no paper trail, but the victim of that unauthorized surveillance doesn't know who was spying on him or her. That's one of the greatest injustices about warrantless surveillance, is that the victim is being assailed upon by all sides and has to guess where the arrows are coming from. And what Trump was right about was fundamentally the fact that he was being spied upon. That is correct. Somebody was accessing his servers. Trump was right about that. Somebody with a high-level access was accessing his servers. Trump was right about that. The reason that Trump was more right than wrong is because these DNS lookups were done with somebody who had White House level access or some sort of access relating to the White House. And in this case, that would be under the Obama administration, and we'll get back to this because Obama had nothing to do with any of this, based on what I saw in the filing. It's just that when you have Hillary Clinton's campaign, there's a lot of overlap between Democratic lifers. And so the same staff might be using the same access. That's harder to figure out, but simply at this point, we know that somebody with very high level access was attempting or did attempt to access and succeeded in accessing Trump's servers. So Trump can be forgiven for not knowing exactly who that person was, simply given the fact that it was done by someone with a high level access that would be similar to an intelligence agency with that level of access. The second issue is, who was it? The filing says that it was a cybersecurity expert within Hillary Clinton's campaign. And the filing indicates that this person is one of the most accomplished cybersecurity experts in American history. He's got multiple patents to his name. And when we talk about DNS lookups, I believe, don't quote me on this, but one of the patents, at least one of them, has to do with just the protocol related to DNS lookups. In other words, this is the person who in some way was innovating around that space. And there's no allegations against him particularly. He is not under threat of indictment. He was on the Clinton's team campaign when in the run-up for the election of 2016. And it appears that the person who is about to go in front of a grand jury is a lawyer called Susskind. And this person used the cybersecurity experts' prowess and access in order to determine whether or not the Trump campaign, through one of its servers, was using backdoor or secret access, or I should say non-transparent access, in order to communicate with a server linked to a Russian bank called Alpha. In other words, this lawyer was using resources from the Hillary Clinton campaign or team in order to determine whether or not the Trump campaign was communicating with a foreign government in violation of the law, and doing so in a way that was secret, and therefore, depending on the information accessed or communicated, potentially illegal. That much is not up for dispute. Now here's where it gets really interesting. At a certain point in time, this lawyer goes in and talks to the DOJ, another lawyer, and tells this person, and this is where it gets interesting, this is the crux of the issue, what went on in this conversation, tells this person that he's going to hand over information, that detailed information, alleging a potential secret backdoor channel between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. During that conversation, this part is undisputed. The lawyer does not tell the DOJ or the FBI. I don't know exactly who was in that meeting, right? So this is one of the problems at this early stage. But the lawyer tells what is supposed to be a nonpartisan law enforcement agency, tells them that someone who might potentially be an American president in 2016 is essentially a foreign agent, potentially. And remember that these law enforcement agencies are supposed to be nonpartisan. And by doing this and not disclosing that this person is affiliated with the Hillary Clinton campaign, the information being passed on, this tip being passed on, is taken seriously, in part because it is coming from a respected source, and in part because it is detailed, obviously. Remember, this is content being disclosed from one of the best cybersecurity experts in the world, and it's being given to a nonpartisan law enforcement agency in order for them to spur them to investigate a criminal conduct. And one of the reasons it's going to be taken seriously is precisely because it appears to be objective. It appears to be unaffiliated with the Clinton campaign, with somebody who would be opposed to the Trump campaign, or with somebody who would have a bias against the Trump campaign. And during this conversation, the question is, when you're giving a tip to either the DOJ or the FBI, how much information are you supposed to disclose about your potential conflicts of interest? And in this case, you can imagine, had Susskind gone in and said, listen, this information is coming from somebody in the Hillary Clinton campaign. Just a heads up. That's just, but he's one of the best people out there, and I take his data and research seriously. Had he said that, we wouldn't be here. There would be no filing. But it gets even worse for the Clinton campaign, because it appears, well, no, it's true. If the filing is true, and the special counsel, by the way, is also nonpartisan, and so there's no reason to believe that the filing has untrue allegations. The question is whether he can prove them in court under the appropriate standard. Filing says, as part of this information given to the FBI that was purportedly objective, the FBI, and I don't know whether the information was given to the DOJ and then from the DOJ to the FBI, but eventually the FBI gets a hold of it and is confronted with evidence indicating unique, rare Russian mobile devices capturing data. And presumably, well, first of all, this turns out to be false. These so-called Russian devices were not rare, or Russian-linked devices were not rare. The allegation was that this had to be Russian involvement because of the uniqueness of the hardware, which would be found primarily among Russians and not Americans or some other country. So, FBI, and this is during the time that James Comey is in office, is in charge of the FBI. And Comey is one of the most honest people, and this is, in government. You look at his history, one of the most honest people anywhere you can find throughout his entire career. And what's interesting, by the way, is a lawyer who made this filing is also one of the most honest people in the government throughout his career. The lawyer took on both the FBI itself and the mob and successfully went after both of them. But Comey, if you look at his history, and is quite frankly an unexpected intellectual. The FBI is derided as, and I've actually alleged that they're just a bunch of cops with, higher level security clearances. But Comey is unique in that he's an intellectual. His Twitter handle was the secret one. Well, and now it's not so secret, he disclosed it. But it was the name of a high level philosopher that was, that influenced Martin Luther King. I just read some of his work. Probably one of the greatest philosophers in the English language, in English speaking history. And that was the handle that James Comey was using when he was on Twitter previously. And so you can imagine you have an honest FBI, and this is remarkable given the history of the FBI under Hoover. It's remarkable that Comey, of all the people in the world, to be in the FBI at this particular point in time, gets this information, presumably does something with it, right? Begins to investigate. At a certain point in time, and this is where, again, we're only in the preliminary stages. We don't know what happened other than the fact that eventually no Russian collusion was identified between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. And the basis for that collusion was this tip given to the FBI about backdoor secret communications channels. And that tip essentially came from the Hillary Clinton campaign. Now, if you're Comey in the middle of an election and you figure this out, you figure out the data that was given to you was designed to mislead you. In other words, it was all smoke, and didn't have any stuff, and no fire. If you figure this out back then, the only thing an honest law enforcement official would do is become extremely upset at the attempted politicization of the FBI. In other words, the attempt to make the FBI a nonpartisan law enforcement agency, at the attempt to make it a tool or handmaiden of the Democratic Party against the Republican Party. So that's the second issue that happens here. With all just so many different unique things, right? You can imagine if this had been anybody except for Comey, there would have been no report issued publicly by the FBI before the 2016, shortly before the 2016 election, that alleged, in fact, it was Hillary Clinton servers that were hacked and that revealed some classified information inadvertently and therefore created an issue for national security, as opposed to Trump. What do you think happened there? This is where I'm getting into speculation. So this is why it's one of the reasons why it's so interesting. Because remember I said that there's no proven Russian collusion. But I didn't say there's no proven Russian interference. At some point in time, let's say the Trump campaign figures out what's happening and realizes that it's being set up, accuses the FBI of spying on it in order to force the FBI to do something, to prove that it's not partisan. Because if you are the FBI in the middle of a campaign and you're given this quote-unquote objective information, you don't know there's a conflict of interest, and you pursue some sort of action against the Trump campaign. And let's say Trump wins, or let's say it turns out that you were wrong. The problem here is that you now look partisan, even though you didn't mean to be. You look like a partisan agency. You look like, especially if Hillary Clinton wins, it looks like you, Comey, somebody who prides himself on honesty and integrity, have been suckered by the Hillary Clinton campaign. The question is, what happens next? The question is, the Trump campaign at this point might be getting information about the FBI digging in and attempting to figure out what is going on with its servers. The question here is, at this point, when the Russians are falsely accused of communicating with the Trump campaign, at this point, does the Russian government begin to actively hack into Hillary Clinton's servers in order to take classified information, in order to punish the campaign for making a false allegation against the Russian government? I don't know the answer to that. However, somebody who has one of the best cybersecurity experts in the world on her campaign, working for her campaign, you would imagine it would take someone high up in order to infiltrate her servers. And if it is indeed the Russian government, that would be shocking, simply because states don't typically, they try to have a fig leaf when they engage in hacking. They go through a private company, they go through anyone but themselves, right? The whole idea is that you're able to either spoof or, mask the source of the hacking. But in any case, what happens here is that Hillary Clinton's servers are the ones that become compromised. Now, during this time, how does the FBI, of course, it's now incentivized to be partisan, so it's going to be very sensitive to any allegations that, in fact, it's Hillary who has poor cybersecurity. And in order to make sure that it is partisan during an election year, regardless of the outcome of the election, it would make sense, if you're an honest law enforcement official, to say, well, we've gone ahead and investigated the Trump campaign, let's see what's happening with the Hillary Clinton campaign. And if during the course of that investigation it turns out that you're given information showing and proving that, in fact, Hillary Clinton's data on her servers were not adequately maintained and created a risk inadvertently to revealing national security secrets. If that happens, then what would you do if you're an honest law enforcement official? I think what Comey did was he realizes, oh boy, I've got, on the one hand, someone who apparently, if not lied to me, gave me misleading information, or I should say, a non-comprehensive information. And now, on the other side, it turns out that there is an issue on the other side. What do I do here? Not knowing the outcome of this election. I'm going to be blamed, and not just me, but the FBI as an institution, which has a checkered history, is going to be blamed for not saying something and doing something when confronted with evidence involving a campaign's mishandling of cybersecurity practices. So at that point, Comey issues a report, and by all indications, costs Hillary Clinton the election. Because it is a scathing report. It's not partisan. It goes out of its way to be polite. But it does indicate very negative issues around the Clinton campaign during that time. So the question here is, what's the timeline? I've tried to create the timeline for you, but again, I can't do it because part of it is speculative. But it makes sense. If you have as your guiding star the fact that Comey is an honest government official, concerned about the FBI becoming a partisan or getting dragged into a partisan political battle. So those would be the two issues that you want to think about regarding the Durham investigation, which is, number one, what was said between the meeting with the government's law enforcement agencies and with a lawyer in Hillary Clinton's campaign. What exactly was said? It appears, well, again, if we take the allegations in the filing to be true, then we can say that no disclosures were made regarding a conflict of interest that may have otherwise caused a different allocation of resources, more skeptical behavior. We don't know. Now, that's the one issue. Number two, what data was actually, quote unquote, gathered? Was anything intercepted? If so, was it intercepted without a warrant? Are we only looking at, just pinging somebody's servers? I mean, what are we looking at here? A cybersecurity expert is better positioned to talk about this than me. So I'm not going to go into that, but that is the other issue, is, what exactly was done by the cybersecurity expert, and what were his findings? Because according to the report, the findings were, they were misleading. It didn't say that there were actual communications between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. It said that we have this mobile hardware that's rare, and we're assuming based on this make and model that the Russian government is involved. The question is, what did the cybersecurity expert believe that this data actually indicated or would speak to a probability rather than a possibility of Russian involvement? In other words, is this a lawyer taking the data and then trumping it up, fluffing it up, exaggerating it in order to reach a specific conclusion, in order to sway a national election? Or was this just, hey, here's a lawyer, I've taken the data, I've taken the white papers, I've taken the research, and here it is, FBI, did you take a look? What was a lawyer's involvement when he passed on that data and those findings to the FBI? Was anything changed? Was anything added? Was anything clarified? And if so, were the clarifications the same as what the cybersecurity expert would have also told the FBI? That's the second issue. We're too early in the game to figure that part out. So we have those two issues right off the bat. The third issue is we understand now why the FBI released that report in the middle of a campaign, because it was concerned about its reputation and it wanted to make sure that it maintained the nonpartisan nature of the FBI. That part is the easiest part to figure out. So the last issue is an issue that is raised by the lawyer for the Clinton campaign, which is, listen, you, the FBI, solicit tips. You do it on your website. You rely on the public to, in giving you information. And I've actually done this, by the way. There's a website, you go on there, but you have to say it's under penalty of perjury. You can't just, submit a tip. So it's under penalty of perjury, from my understanding. That's another question. When this information was submitted, was it under penalty of perjury? It didn't go through the online system. So what was signed? Was the DOJ or the FBI deficient to the extent that it failed to get a statement of penalty of perjury when receiving this data? Did it somehow become more lenient because it happened to be dealing with a prominent lawyer? And if so, is it now attempting to cover up its own negligence by going after the lawyer in order to punish the lawyer for taking advantage of its trust? Again, me, common citizen, I submit a tip to the FBI. It's under penalty of perjury. If I lie, there's a slam dunk prosecution against me, to the extent that I lied to the FBI when submitting that tip. And so that's one of the reasons why this filing may not mention a penalty of perjury argument. It only mentions, as far as I know, one of the things it mentions is a conflict of interest. So in other words, is Durham prohibited from alleging a perjury argument because the FBI or the DOJ treated this lawyer differently than a common citizen? Oops. The other argument made here is that since you, the FBI, and obviously the DOJ, you want people to come to you and give you information. So that's what we did. And so if you're going to put more restrictions on the kind of information that you receive, and you're going to punish people for not disclosing every single conflict of interest, I'm playing devil's advocate, you're not going to get as many tips. People just won't give you tips, and you will be, your role in fighting crime will be diminished. That argument doesn't sit well with me, simply because of all the different factors involved. You're dealing with information given to you and your client, right? The resources coming from somebody who is billing the Clinton campaign. So there's a direct nexus. This isn't like, oh, right, I came to you and I gave you this information, and it turns out that my cousin or my brother-in-law happened to work for a subsidiary of the Clinton Foundation. That's not what this is. This is, again, by all accounts, a deliberate attempt to make the FBI a partisan agency, to basically stick or use the FBI as an attack dog against one of the presidential contenders. But that's the argument that the lawyer is making for the Clinton campaign. He's saying that if you force us to disclose everything, then what you're going to do as a public policy issue is minimize the number and quality of tips that you get. And so you, Your Honor, the judge, go ahead and dismiss this. There's nothing to see here. The FBI solicits tips. I gave them a tip. There's nothing, again, if they didn't go through the standard process online, we don't know what documents were signed. And the lawyer could be making an argument that, well, listen, maybe I had a conflict that involves my bar association, the licensing agency that allows me to practice law. Maybe there's an issue there, but that's different from what's in the filing. We gave information. It was the FBI's job to figure out what to do with it. And if the FBI is nonpartisan, it's their job to make sure they have procedures in place for allocating resources and so on and so forth. And in any case, playing devil's advocate, so what? The FBI didn't rely on the data. It didn't do anything with the data. It would have done an investigation anyway, or would have done a similar investigation. It didn't really change anything in the end. No harm, no foul. The reason that argument might work is because, again, if there was no statement under penalty of perjury, is because I don't know exactly what the requirements are if you go through a backdoor channel or an informal channel to give information to the FBI or the DOJ. What are your obligations? It's different, you can imagine it's different, right? If Bill Gates shows up to the FBI and says, I've got evidence of an international hacking group based in a foreign country interfering with an election versus someone like me. That's different, right? The question is whether Bill Gates or whether, Nadella or whether, Cook or Steve Jobs and so on. The question is whether when someone that high goes to you and gives you a tip, do they have different obligations because of who they are and what access they presumably have? Now that's interesting, and the good news is that we have, in this case, we mentioned Obama before, the judge overseeing this motion to dismiss, I believe, is an Obama appointee. And it's a good judge. I looked him up, good judge. So the good news is we've got a very good special counsel and a very good judge. So that gives me some faith that we'll get to the bottom of all this, simply because of those two men involved. And of course, the other upside here is that if you're the Obama White House, you might be a little upset that someone in the Hillary Clinton campaign was using some related access in order to investigate political enemies. Or, it's not as if the Obamas and the Clintons got along, well anyway, but this would be, again, we're going back to issues of trust and misuse of resources and so on and so forth. So the other interesting issue is that it may very well be that, that the Hillary Clinton campaign might allege bias by the judge because it's an Obama appointee. And we're dealing with a situation involving the Obama White House. But again, by all accounts, the judge involved is nonpartisan, very smart, hardworking, and someone who's interested in the truth. That's a good thing. Looks like the system so far is working. We'll see what happens with this motion. But I hope I've sort of boiled down the different arguments to make it make sense. I realize I've spent far too long on it, and I apologize for that. There's no way to do it simply because of all the different issues involved. There's no way to do it without speculating on some level, because we're still in the early stages. But I can tell you the reason I'm doing this is because all the information I've seen online, whether from CNN or even non-mainstream sources that have done the work, don't adequately explain all the different issues. And I've tried to explain all the different issues involved, hopefully in a way that's accessible. And that's all. We'll see where this goes.